Dr. Randy Spire. I'm the clinical director here at Christian Counseling Service. I've been here for 2 years. I have 33 years of clergy experience, so I'm also an ordained minister. It varies from pastor to pastor, but I think in general, most pastors would say that their purpose of what they do is spiritual leadership, and that involves a lot of things, from standing up in the pulpit, opening up the Bible, giving a good expository sermon, to doing more shepherding. And that's kind of where the word pastor comes from, is shepherd of the flock. So the purpose of the pastor, I think, is to be a spiritual guide, a spiritual leader, and to facilitate spiritual growth with the people that he or she serves. I worked within the Seventh-day Adventist denomination, and we do have a code of ethics that pastors are to follow.
More than just the Bible?
Yes, exactly.
Like
Hopefully all consistent with biblical principles, but yeah, we try to make sure that our ethics are consistent with people in the workforce that are of similar professions, like a counselor would be someone of kind of a similar profession. Yeah, we did. We had, we're kind of centrally governed, so out of what we call the General Conference comes the policies and procedures that people who work under that umbrella follow. So yeah, the Code of Ethics is developed by the sort of the general governing assembly.
Okay, so it was pretty clear then, it wasn't just like
it was pretty clear, and part of our training at both the undergraduate level as well as the graduate level in seminary was to kind of refresh ourselves on making sure that we understood what good ethical guidelines for pastors involved. I would say consistently with pastors, as well as for me individually, would be just the subject of boundaries, personal boundaries, professional boundaries. That can be boundaries of, where to draw the line between work and your own family, your own personal life, which can sometimes be challenging. Oftentimes pastors are sort of on call 24 hours a day, have to be available to parishioners at all times of the day and night. I think people in the congregation oftentimes view the pastor as needing to be available, so sometimes those boundary issues become very diffuse. And actually my PhD dissertation was actually written on the subject of boundaries and being a pastor, so certainly something of interest to me. Other boundaries would be, boundaries between, as a pastor, you've got to make sure and maintain very clear boundaries between people kind of view you not only as a spiritual leader, but also as an authority figure. So sometimes there's the vulnerability of boundaries with, for example, the opposite sex. And so you have to make sure, and I would say that's the one that I had to be very clear on, and my wife was part of that, conversation of making sure that she felt safe with my boundaries as a pastor, and that I was making sure and maintaining very clear boundaries in my relationship with people in my congregation, particularly people of the opposite sex. So you have to just make sure you're maintaining sexual fidelity, make sure that you're not crossing lines with people that are oftentimes in a very more vulnerable state. and not abusing that. So the way our church is structured is we have the general assembly, or we call it conference, and then there are union conferences. So locally there's a Pacific Union Conference that includes California, Hawaii, Arizona, Nevada. And within that there are local conferences. So our local conference is actually located in Riverside.
Mm-hmm.
And they're responsible for making sure that pastors are following ethical guidelines. And, that can happen, practically speaking. They'll have a representative called a ministerial secretary or director, and he or she will make sure and be interacting with pastors, and if they're having problems, if they're having situations where they need to talk about maybe a fuzzy boundary in the congregation. We also encourage pastors to make sure that they have partners of accountability in their lives. So if they're struggling in a certain area, they've got people in their life that they can answer to, that they can go to. We've also, over the last number of years, we've offered pastors in this conference anonymous counseling. So we're actually one of the sites where a lot of pastors and teachers come for that. So they can actually get a coupon and get free counseling. So the governing board actually pays for that, and they don't even know that those employees are going for counseling, so it keeps it real anonymous. And that gives them the opportunity, if they're having struggles with things, that they can actually pursue help in those areas. Yeah. So I think, unfortunately, this has all happened probably a little bit later than it should have, with all the crisis in the Catholic Church between priests and parishioners, and we've had some struggles within our own church. I think this should have happened a long time ago, but I think we're really trying to be more preventative at this point, and really helping pastors to be clear in their boundaries, to do good self-care, which is also a challenge for pastors because they're giving so much to people. So I would say that's kind of an ethical concern, as well as that they're taking good care of themselves.
Yeah.
As a pastor in those 33 years, I was always very interested in sort of, we only had one class that wasn't really that great of a class in seminary on counseling. So I've always pursued other counseling classes. So I've always been very intentional about understanding the ethical responsibility of confidentiality and how that applies to ministry and to pastoring. Because I think those both are very sacred relationships, the counseling relationship as well as the pastor-congregant relationship. And so I've always made a very intentional effort, whether it's people coming in and talking to me about a family situation, whether it's maybe, one of the challenges oftentimes within the congregation is like the board. There's a governing board of the local church. And so making sure that decisions that are made in the board, or conversations that are conducted at the board level, that we're being very confidential about those conversations. So I think the need for following the guideline and the ethical guideline of confidentiality is as important as in the counseling setting. So people come trusting that you're going to keep the information that you that's offered to you in confidence. And the one I think of, primarily is non-malfeasance, which is, we don't want to do our congregants harm in the way we listen to what their stories are, and then making sure that we're protective of what they offer. Autonomy, I was thinking about, in terms of how it impacts us as pastors. theologically, our church tends to come from a tradition that emphasizes a person's freedom to choose, as opposed to, for example, someone that comes from more of a Calvinist tradition. It's more that the predestination idea. Everyone's predestined to a certain path. So I think as a church, we're very big on allowing a person to have a sense of agency, a sense of autonomy over their own life, the freedom to choose the path that they follow, the spiritual path that they follow. I think it's important as a pastor to really empower that within people. So oftentimes a practical way that I do that, not only as a pastor but as a counselor, is by making that person the expert over their own life. That's a bit postmodern. I guess I'm a postmodern pastor. But really emphasizing that I'm not the expert coming in on what you should be doing, or that you're really the expert on who you are in your own path. And so giving them that sense of control over their own life, I think is really important. Yeah, I would say the primary abuse of power that happens in the church setting is definitely the cross of sexual boundaries. That's within not just the Catholic Church but many churches. It's just a huge temptation, and I'm not sure that we're doing enough preventative work with pastors, but I just think there's clearly the understanding of that we're in a position of authority. Not only are we kind of in this, position of traditional authority, but there's also this sort of idea that we represent God, which is kind of a big, powerful position to be in. So to cross that boundary is such a violation of trust, of such a violation of what it means to be human. And I think that's, in my mind, that's clearly the one that I see as the biggest danger in pastoral circles.
Mm-hmm.